This video is brought to you by the Logitech Lightspeed Wireless range of keyboards, mice and headsets, the benchmark in wireless gaming performance.
After teasing additional enhancements for backwards compatibility, we finally have our first handful of games supporting what Microsoft is calling FPS boost. The idea is to increase the frame rate of previous generation games beyond where they were previously capped without touching the codebase. So today then, we're taking a look at the first few games to support this to see how this technique fares when compared against the original games running on original hardware. For this video then, I'm joined by Richard Ledbetter to discuss it.
Hey John, so this is really interesting stuff, fascinating even, because Microsoft has already announced that it's going to be doubling the frame rate on certain legacy games. We had a demo of Fallout 4, and we've actually been able to run Fallout 4 with double the frame rate using mods. But this isn't the approach Microsoft is using, and curiously, Fallout 4 is not actually one of the first batch of games that supports it. Now, I didn't have the chance to talk to Microsoft about this, but you did. So why don't you clue us in a bit?
Yeah, that's right. So for this first wave of titles, we have some rather interesting choices, I guess you could say. Essentially, there's 5 games that support this feature: Far Cry 4, Watch Dogs 2, New Super Lucky's Tale, UFC 4, and Sniper Elite 4, with UFC 4 being kind of the newest title on the list, having just released kind of midway through 2020. Now, what's interesting here, though, is that of these 5 titles, 3 of them lack support for the Xbox One X, which means that they were all running in the base Xbox One mode. But it's interesting because I did speak briefly with Jason over at Microsoft there, Jason Ronald, and essentially they're doing this sort of at the D3D level. There is no game code being modified here at all. There's no I adjustments, nothing like that. It's a technique where they're essentially sending data back from D3D back to the game faster than it originally did, in a way so that the game itself thinks it's still running at the original frame rate. So if a game was 30 and now it runs at 60 when using FPS boost, to the game, at least as far as it knows, it's still running at 30. It just looks like 60 frames per second now. So it's kind of a weird trick that they're doing. So I like the idea though, because it's very like, it's this high level adjustment that can be applied to a wide range of titles. And they even said that, you know, down the line we can see like original Xbox and Xbox 360 games perhaps.
It's fascinating. It kind of reminds me of the kind of direct 3D injectors that you see on the PC, only this is rolling out on the console side, and it's all fully validated, fully tested, that kind of thing. But yeah, curious that Fallout isn't in the initial batch of titles, and that if it was, it would be using an entirely different approach to the mod here. But yeah, some fascinating games in the lineup, so why don't we go through them in turn? I think we divided them up between us, and some really interesting results here.
That's right. So I guess the first big one that we looked at, and perhaps one of the more ambitious, I guess you could say, is Watch Dogs 2. And you wanted to check this one out.
I did.
But I guess it's worth noting that this one was actually released in 2016, so while it does support the PS4 Pro with a high-resolution mode, it never received support for Xbox One X, which means it's limited to 900p. But how does the rest of it play out?
Yeah, it's kind of curious. 2 different approaches, really. The PS4 Pro, I think, from memory, it was using 1800p checkerboard, but it was still 30 frames per second. What you're seeing here is pretty impressive, actually. It is still 900p, but it is running at full 60 frames per second. And the reason I wanted to check this out, first of all, I've played it in the past and was kind of curious to revisit it. But more than that, it's actually quite a CPU-heavy game because it is an open-world title, and there's a lot going on in terms of simulation and background streaming and whatnot. So I was really curious to see how the series consoles would stack up. I played it on both the Series S and the X, and well, it's just a locked 60 frames per second start to finish. Doesn't matter if you're playing on Series S, doesn't matter if you're playing on Series X. They pretty much produce exactly the same results, which is to say all of the issues that the Xbox One S version had, and there are many, all cleaned up here. And if we actually go back and look at the One S version, targets 30 frames per second. That's the maximum throughput you're going to be getting. But it does have a lot of performance issues, specifically in traversal. You can be just driving through the city. You'll get bouts of screen tearing and drops to frame rate. I've actually got a combat stress test scenario here, which you can see running on the S1S and the Series S. Same scenario here where we're just trying to get away from some police, but rather than trying to get away from them, I'm just sort of staying in the same area and attracting as many police as possible. And you can see that the 1S really struggles. Series S, silky smooth, 60 frames per second. So yeah, I mean, GPU side of the equation is taken care of, no problems at all. Locked 60, no more tearing. And yeah, I was kind of more concerned about the CPU side of things in running that open world, but there's just no problem at all for the Zen 2 cluster here. It's just flat out 60 frames per second. Really impressive stuff. Bit disappointing you can't increase the resolution for the complete package, but there it is. It's definitely well worth checking out.
Yeah, that is interesting because you're right. Fundamentally, with 3 of these games, it is going to be equivalent on Xbox Series X and S. So it's and that's actually true of the next game as well, which is Far Cry 4.
Right.
So this one was released in 2014, I believe, and it's a beautiful game. But again, due to its release date, it does not support the Xbox One X, which means you only get the one base machine resolution, which in this case is unique because it actually runs at 1440 by 1080. Whereas the PS4 version was actually 1920 by 1080 by comparison. So it never looked quite as clean, but it does use, I think they called it HRAA, which was sort of a temporal take on anti-aliasing, at a time when TAA and such was still kind of in its infancy.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
It's pretty effective, I think, right? Like, it looks a little, softer, obviously, but it seems sharper than, say, just a 900p game.
Yep, definitely. I mean, the PS4 version was 1920 by 1080, full 1080p, but it also used the HRAA, so you got the temporal accumulation there as well. But I guess we can't have additional resolution with this. It's out of the remit.
Exactly. But of course, being that this is part of the program, you would expect the frame rate to improve. That's exactly what we see here. So just like with Watch Dogs 2, the game is bumped up to 60 frames per second, and based on the time I spent briefly playing through some of the intro sections here, it's 100% locked. Very, very stable 60 frames per second, and even traversing the open world, there weren't any noticeable stutters, hitches, or anything that sort of got in the way of the experience. And this is exactly the same on both Series X and Series S. In comparison to the original Xbox One S, though, it actually kind of highlighted this was an example of a game that ran really well on both of the consoles at launch, and I think we kind of lauded it back in the day for this as well, because it delivers a pretty smooth 30 frames per second experience, actually. It's not, there's occasional little blips here and there, but by and large, it's pretty darn stable, I would say. So it's, in that sense, I think Ubisoft did a really good job here, technically speaking. But obviously, boosting up to 60 does make a big difference. The game feels a lot better as a result, and it's very, very stable.
Yeah, excellent stuff. I mean, I kind of wish we'd had Far Cry 5, because that had the 1X support, and obviously a much later game. Really looks spectacular. I mean, we played it at 60 on PC, but, at the same time, I kind of like the idea of going back to legacy games and giving them a bit of TLC, and it certainly pays off here.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think it pays off perhaps even more with the next title, which is the other title that you spent time with, and that's Sniper Elite 4.
Yeah, so this is a really interesting one, because I've never played Sniper Elite before. So I went in sort of with no real expectations of what to expect. First of all, I tried it on Xbox One S. Now, this game is highly dynamic. We can't really do A to B comparisons here because the scenarios are very, very different from one game to the next. But it's pretty clear to see what's happening on the 1S. It's really not very good. Looking back at Tom's coverage back in the day, this game runs at 1080p on PS4, Xbox One, and indeed PS4 Pro. Frame rate is unlocked, or at least it was back in the day on the PS4 and the Pro. And, well, it never quite hit 1080p 60 on either of the PlayStation platforms. So, Xbox One S here, it really is struggling. I mean, it's capped at 30 frames per second. The tearing is just so obvious whenever it encounters any kind of issue. Challenging parts of the scenery cause significant drops to frame rate. Even if there's a slight drop to performance, you get full screen tearing, which really detracts from the quality of the experience. The game's kind of standout X-ray kills, all of those see performance drop significantly down to the low 20s in the worst case, complete with that eye-rending screen tear. It's really not pleasant at all. But I actually kind of really like the game, and that's where the Series S comes in to begin with, because, you know, most of those performance drops are completely resolved. It is, for the most part, 1080p 60 frames per second. I think based on the outlook here, you are getting a better experience than PS4 Pro. Game is really, really impressive. However, there are still scenarios, some X-ray kills, some transparency issues that do cause performance to drop from 60 frames per second. And that's kind of fascinating, but I also played the same levels through on Xbox Series X. Again, it's 1080p. You're not getting any boost to resolution there. But the vast amount of extra horsepower the Series X has does solve the issues. I don't think it's a big deal. I still think it's pretty tremendous on Series S. So yeah, this is definitely one to check out, especially as it's on Game Pass at the moment. So if you've got a Series console, I highly recommend checking it out. I had never played Sniper Elite 4, seen some footage here and there, looked quite amusing, but I actually think there's a really good tactical shooter in here, and it's well worth checking out, and it just flies on Series consoles. So this is a big tick as far as I'm concerned.
Cool, that's great. Yeah, I know the series has its fans, for sure. It looks good. I haven't checked it out either, though. But the next title, though, I have played before, and it's quite a fun little game. This is New Super Lucky's Tale, which is kind of the sequel to the sequel of a game originally developed for the Oculus Rift. So it's kind of a weird situation, but essentially this is the first title thus far today, though, that does actually support Xbox One X. And the difference here is pretty vast, I'd say, like perhaps more so than usual, because on Xbox One X, the game was already native 4K at 60 frames per second. So it looks great. But on Xbox One S, it's not only dropped to 1080p, but it's also reduced to 30 frames per second.
Yeah, it's kind of weird, right? And I seem to recall there were also sort of blips and glitches on the One X version. I'm not sure if that was cleared up with patches or whatever, but...
Yeah, that was better in the new version, because the original Super Lucky's Tale had some more issues, and this is the new version, which also showed up on the Nintendo Switch and everything. So it's kind of an enhanced edition, if you will. But this is perhaps, from my perspective, the most interesting FPS boost title at launch here, because this one goes all the way up to 120 frames per second. And this is true on both Series S and Series X.
Okay.
And this obviously has the limitation. This is one where you actually see a difference, though, because on Series S, like the One S, it is capped at 1080p, whereas on the Series X, it's instead running at native 4K. So you actually get a full native 4K 120 frames per second game on here, and it's pretty darn stable, I'd say. And it looks really, really smooth. 120 frames per second for a platform game, especially if you turn on something like a black frame insertion, looks really, really good. Like super, super clean in motion. So it's kind of cool to see. But I think more than the game itself, it's more this proof of concept that they can actually up a game all the way to 120 frames per second, which I think is really potentially a game changer if this becomes a more common thing. I would like to see other games take this sort of leap forward, because it really adds a lot to these classic titles.
So the 30 FPS, 60 FPS divide on the Xbox One generation of consoles always seemed a bit weird to me because there was a vast resolution differential as well. But I think what's impressive about this is that, the Series S typically taps into the 1S code path, and we should have been seeing 60 frames per second here if we were talking about just a doubling of performance, but they're actually quadrupling it here.
Yeah, exactly. And that's kind of the big surprise, I think, is that that's a significant boost in rendering demand there. So it's kind of unusual to see because, it's not if you look at the difference between like the original 1S and like the Series S, it's almost kind of like the Xbox One versus, say, the PS4 Pro. And you usually didn't see such a vast difference in performance between those machines. But obviously this has the additional Zen 2 CPU as well, and various other enhancements that probably contribute to this, because this is a Unity game, and often Unity games sort of hit the CPU pretty hard, which can explain some of the weird spikes it may have had in the past. But either way, it turned out really nicely here, so that's great.
Nice, good stuff.
But the last game then, this one's curious. This is UFC 4. This one came out last year. This already supports Xbox One X. And this one actually has 2 modes on the One X. So let me lay these out first. So if you play on an Xbox One or One S, the game is 900p at 30 frames per second. Now, if you play on the Xbox One X, you have 2 modes, performance and quality. In performance mode, the game is 1080p at 60 frames per second. And in quality mode, it is 1800p at 30 frames per second. But in all versions, or I guess on both versions, in all 3 modes, all of the interstitial scenes, the introduction sequences, everything like that are all rendered at 30 frames per second, no matter which mode you choose.
Okay.
So when you come over to the Series consoles then, that means Series S, while it's still 900p, everything now runs at 60 frames per second. Then on Series X, whether you choose quality or performance mode, it doesn't really matter. You can still choose both. The game is also 60 frames per second across the board. And I say that because that means all of the scenes, the interstitial scenes, the cutscenes, the in-game stuff. The only thing that's still 30 is the menu itself and the pre-rendered FMVs, which, you can't really change that. But everything that's rendered in real time is bumped up to 60 FPS. And it sort of smooths out many of the hitches that you would get, especially with the sort of crossfades where they kind of have to render 2 scenes at once. The 1S really doesn't like this. And you definitely get some pretty weird performance wonky dips and even spikes there as well. So, I mean, it's pretty clear cut. If you play this on the Series X, you're getting 1800p at 60 frames per second, and it looks really, really good. But even on the 1S, it's good too.
So the 1080p mode, which was targeting 60 on 1X, is still 60 on Series X?
Correct. I tested that. It does not boost it to 120.
Intriguing.
So I think it's something that's not just like a straight doubling that's going on here. It's something they have to configure on the back end. But yeah, this game seems to be 60 FPS across the board.
So I think in terms of an overall, a delivery of proof of concept, this is all really, really impressive stuff. It's just kind of the choice of titles that's kind of strange, and also the fact that 3 of the 5 only have Xbox One support, so they're kind of limited to 900p and 1080p.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, to me, this is kind of like a tech demo of stuff that's to come, and it's really interesting to see that it works, and it does work extremely well. Like, all of these games are very, very consistent now. It really just comes down to why these games. I mean, I assume the reason is that these just happen to work really well, and they're probably going through, and it sounds like they spent a lot of time testing all kinds of different titles, and Fallout 4 is still being tested as well. But it's, I mean, it's a weird way to put this step forward. I feel like they could have used one more sort of like a big heavy hitting title here for this. But if you overlook, what the games are, and all of these games are at least solid games, it's just nothing like world shattering. But the technology and the technique is interesting and promising. Jason also mentioned that there's some updates coming to the way this works from the user side, where apparently you'll be able to sort of adjust things per game. So like the FPS boost setting, auto HDR, you should be able to turn this on and off. I don't know if it's directly in this new update, but that is coming as well, so it can be adjusted per game. They've also said that they can make changes to things like anisotropic filtering if need be, and various other little tweaks along the way to either improve performance or enhance image quality. The weird thing is, though, is it kind of reminds me of, I mean, we'll see how many titles they release, but it kind of reminds me of the bespoke patches for games like Ghost of Tsushima and Days Gone, and even God of War, where those were PS4 Pro games that all receive 60 FPS sort of enhancements that work on PS5, and it kind of feels like a similar thing here, but based on what I've learned about what they're doing in the background, it seems to be more like game agnostic, where it just kind of works, but there can be glitches and they kind of have to test and improve it to make it work with everything. So I suspect we'll be seeing more titles like this in the future.
Yeah, those titles on PS5 running PS4 code, they did require the developers to go back in and patch the games, presumably update them to the cross-gen SDK, that kind of thing. Whereas this is kind of more interesting in many ways, because there's going to be many games, probably all of these, bar perhaps UFC 4, which are highly unlikely to get updated to the latest XDKs. So the ability to actually tweak at the system level and to boost performance that way, I think it's fair to say that all of the games are radically improved just by having baseline 60 frames per second support and far higher levels of consistency in performance than last gen systems. I think it's a really worthwhile endeavor. I'm really looking forward to seeing more. And very interesting choice of titles to begin with. And I agree that we could have done with one kind of massive AAA juggernaut to be the spearhead of sorts. But I'll tell you what, I really did enjoy checking out Watch Dogs 2 again, and Sniper Elite 4. If I'd played that game on Xbox One S to begin with, I wouldn't have really stuck with it. But the upgrade on Series S and Series X is really game-changing, and it really does bring the concept to the fore, and it's really enjoyable. So in terms of discovery, it's been a really useful tool too.
Absolutely. So I look forward to seeing what else they have in the works. If you're watching this, Microsoft, you've already upgraded Sonic Generations with Xbox One X support. So let's get that up to 60 FPS, shall we? Come on now. But I think that's going to do it for now, though. So thanks for joining me, Rich.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure.
And if you guys enjoyed this video, as always, be sure to like, subscribe, ring the notification bell, check out our Patreon, and follow us over on Twitter. And until next time, this is John and Rich signing off.
A breakthrough in design and engineering, the G915 features Lightspeed Pro-Grade Wireless, advanced LIGHTSYNC RGB, and new high-performance, low-profile mechanical switches. Meticulously crafted from premium materials, the G15 is a sophisticated design of unparalleled beauty, strength and performance. Meet G15 Lightspeed and play the next dimension.